free to kick it off. And then let me share my screen. Okay. Okay. It's visible, I assume. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so thank you all for joining. Do we do intros usually? No. I think I think everyone here knows each other. Piotr, welcome this week. Good to have you here. So just to recap from last week, we merged in this constraints.md. So what we've been doing the last couple of weeks is working through these documents. Maybe I can increase the size here. Working through these documents, which is the rationale document, the technical choices, and then working on an example spec. And so we have merged in the first document, which is the goals and constraints of common life cycle enumeration. And I added feedback that we had from last meeting, and I also addressed the PR comments from Jordan, and then I merged it into master. So for this meeting, I had a new PR that I was hoping we could go over of kind of the example spec. And while I was working, I was kind of working on the technical choices. And I feel like we kind of added some technical choices maybe into the constraints as well, and they got kind of merged in. So I kind of decided to maybe go straight for the spec, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's other stuff we need here before we kind of dive in.
No, I mean, I think it's fine. Like the final deliverable or the like public deliverables, the spec itself. When someone looks at the spec, they're probably going to have questions about all sorts of things depending on what experience they're coming from.
Right.
The goal is to make it easy for them to find the resources to answer those questions. And in theory, the constraints document, like any gap between the constraints document and the spec would be if the constraints document isn't enough for them to intuit why we then made that technical choice. So I would say that if we come onto a technical choice where there are actually multiple viable options per the constraints, that's the thing that would be documented separately. But if like there isn't a viable option, like if the constraints eliminate all but one thing, then I don't know how much we need to document about the alternatives. We could still just list them, but also I think that would be a fine thing to do immediately after like landing a version of the spec. You know, it's like in other words, the constraints are meant to guide our choices and to justify them later. The technical choices document is really just history for others to understand what options we considered and why they were accepted or rejected.
I see.
So so we definitely had, I'm glad we did constraints first. I don't think we have to do the technical decisions first, as long as we don't forget to do it after we do the spec, you know?
Okay. That makes sense. I'll try and
It's just my thinking on it, right? Like I'm not insisting on anything. But.
Yeah. Okay, let me think about that and figure out how we'd kind of, like, what would you usually put in this technical choices that wouldn't be in the spec?
Well, so, okay. On the first time I really wrote a document like this and where I learned the value of it was with the global this proposal for JavaScript. We ended up going with the name global this, and then a bunch of people, like too late to do anything about it anyway, got really mad on the internet about it. And I followed some advice and made this like musts and shoulds document. But what I also did is inline, like, here are the options for a name that are excluded by this constraint. And so I sort of intermingled those two documents into one, so that as you read if you read the whole document, you like maybe you'd come up with some example we didn't think of, but you at least understand how we got to where we are and why your favorite idea couldn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, a year from now, 5 years from now, someone's going to show up and be like, but look at this glorious thing. Why didn't you do it this way?
Mm,
And we need to either demonstrate that we looked at it and didn't choose it for reasons, or nobody suggested it. And the way we can demonstrate that is by saying, here's what was suggested and considered.
right. Yeah. Okay, makes
Or
sense.
I guess the third option is your thing is elegant but doesn't meet these constraints and therefore was never an option, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. I feel like the constraints document might contain all that we need, or
yeah.
if not, we can kind of like add to it.
Yeah, and
Since
I
there's
think
not
of
like
these
an
as living
existing,
documents.
yeah, for sure, for sure. Since there's not like an existing kind of tech stack that maybe exists already, but
Right.
maybe we can dive a little deeper into the technical choices. But like, why do we choose Perl, right? Or why did we choose VERS, right? I think there's definitely benefit in doing that.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's probably the main thing that we're missing so far, and I can backfill that.
And I was mentioning in the TC54 plenary this morning that Ecma approves spec candidates in the June and December GA meetings.
Mm-hmm.
So aiming for June is probably too soon. But I think we should aim to have something that they can approve by December if possible. And it's okay if there's like an initial version and we, have room to expand it in the future, but like, it's also okay if we don't hit that as a deadline, but I think aiming for that is probably healthy.
Mm-hmm. So what was in June?
Sorry, the General Assembly meetings for ECMA,
Okay.
they have 2 a year, and that's where, um, like, generally TC work is approved in their own plenaries, but then when the
Mm-hmm.
TC is ready to like official make something official, they have to submit it to the ECMA GA to be approved.
Mm, I see.
No, there
So
is
like
a
we'd still have to. Oh, go ahead.
multi-month process just to get to that GA,
Yeah.
as Jordan knows. So it first needs to go to the executive committee a couple of months before the GA. So the
Okay.
Exicom needs to go through it and recommend it to the
Right.
GA.
Right. And
If
there's
we
a
want
patent
to,
opt-out period as well.
exactly. So all these processes need to be followed,
Mm-hmm.
which means that, for example, if we want a June, which is not going to be possible, we would
Right.
Mm-hmm.
basically need to submit the final or near final draft of the spec by March 1st.
I
So
see.
if we want to target like the December GA, realistically, we should probably have it in Samina's hands, the Exicom's hands by September-ish.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There's like it's not precisely 3 months. I think there's a little wiggle room, but I think that's the right buffer to aim for.
Yeah.
That makes sense. That's helpful. Thank you.
The one thing that is hard coded is that opt-out period, though.
Yeah.
That's a hard requirement.
And
You
how
can't
long is
shorten
that?
that up.
I think 60 days, but I'm gonna
I
double
think so.
check. And then the GA date sometimes shifts a week forward or a week back or whatever. So it's technically 60 days before the GA would be the absolute latest point, but like that's not very kind to the Exicom because they have to,
Mm-hmm.
review it and so on. So the more buffer we can give, the better.
Okay. So like September 1st.
Yeah, that would be ideal.
Okay.
Which I think we can possibly do.
Yeah. I think we can
Yeah.
have something. It may not have everything we want, but I think we can. It seems realistic to me that by September 1st, we have something that is a good cutoff point, has carved out space for the future additions we know about, and that we feel somewhat confident that we haven't boxed ourselves in any way that we
Mm-hmm.
didn't want to.
Yeah. And is there any like specific milestones that we should be hitting before September that you guys can think of right now?
I mean, the spec that you've got here is not in
Mm-hmm.
the EC markup format, but that's like
Mm-hmm.
I can help translate that. That's not a huge
Yeah.
deal.
Yeah.
Um, And as part of this, we'll probably want to make like a JSON schema and a few other,
Uh-huh.
you know, things, and maybe
Mhm.
like a
Deliverables.
validation tool and stuff. Yeah, but like
Right.
those aren't like September 1st requirements. Those are just like for
Okay.
like PR purposes and adoption purposes. Those tools, we really want them to exist those before the people start using the
Hmm.
spec.
Yeah.
And then I would say we should probably have something ready to submit to the main plenary for that,
Hmm.
for the wider group to review, like significantly before then. So like August 1st-ish, right? Because then
Hmm.
there's 1 or 2, possibly 3 meetings before September 1st. So that gives us time to iterate and so on.
Yeah.
Got it. Got it. Got it. Okay. August 1st. Okay.
Yeah, the more planning that we think we do about this is the sooner that deadline is going to creep up as we think about more buffers.
Yeah.
But still, I
That's
mean, even
realistic because
yeah, go ahead.
TC54 does need to review it.
Yeah.
And there probably will be questions.
Mhm.
We're not going to be able to get through the entirety of the spec in one session.
Right.
So, and we only meet like once a month.
Oh, it's
So,
monthly. Then yeah, then definitely we need at least a month.
right.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So I was just I was planning to review the spec, I think, for this meeting, and then what else we had on the agenda item was kind of brainstorm some ways to get more community involvement. Maybe if you know, specifically knew of companies that would be interested in participating. Oh, and then just to agree to adopt RFC 2119 language.
Mhm.
And then this would be actually the specification that we're reviewing. So let's start with the easy one first. Is everyone okay with using the RFC 2119 language for the spec, or is that a requirement actually for Ecma?
It is a requirement not to use all caps in these words,
Ah,
because it violates both the Ecma style guide and the ISO house guide style guide. So you can't use. However, there is nothing preventing us from using it
yeah.
in our own internal markdown. We just need to present that differently in the human readable text, which is not that big of a deal.
Okay.
But I think for the purposes of clarity in
Hmm.
specification development, I completely agree. We should be doing this.
Oh, using caps or
Uh,
using the, yeah.
yeah, I agree with the RFC 2119 language.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
That's what we
Okay.
do in CycloneDX, and then we just convert that to a form that is suitable by the ECMA style guide.
Oh, I see. I see. Okay, perfect. Okay, great. Brainstorm ways to get more community participation.
So
I was
one of
wondering,
them is that
Jordan
socket.
specifically.
Oh, go
Yeah,
ahead.
Jordan, if you specifically had people that you could think of.
Yeah, well, I mean, socket.dev just joined Ecma, and
Okay.
JDD, who maintains Lodash, is in the Slack. So
Okay.
it's likely that they will want to be involved in some way,
Okay.
given that like once a standard exists, it would probably be useful for them to consume and produce it.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think that it would be, as we get a little farther in the process, like more towards building a tool,
Right.
I think it would be good to pull in uh, NPM,
Yeah.
and or Node, probably more NPM, and other package managers. Um, so folks that work on Cargo, folks that work on Bundler, folks that work on PyPy, like etc.,
Yeah.
Maven, whatever, and just try and brainstorm with them ways that their tooling can integrate with the standard. In other words, that they can obviously not require the presence of this information, but that when present, they could validate it. When present, they could display it on their registry websites. Right? Because that's the sort of thing that I think will really accelerate adoption.
Mhm.
And then the other thing, just sort of unrelated to community adoption, not unrelated, but is I've dropped a few times the Node.js package management working groups support standard. We developed it like 5 years ago, and basically nobody adopted it. But like, it's worth looking at that, and I will page it back in as well so I can give feedback here. But because we thought a lot about use cases, like you shouldn't have to publish a new version of a package to update end of life information. You also shouldn't have to depend on anything but an immutable package registry for ecosystems that offer that to figure out some sort of support information. How do you cohere those two somewhat conflicting constraints?
Mhm.
Also, a lot of people will want to define their support policy for multiple repos at once within an organization or within a user. And so we worked in a URL based way to do that. We could do a .github based way, but like that's somewhat prejudicial to that one, right, source, that one version control place. But like just thinking about those examples, because whether they go in the spec or not, we should be prepared to have that kind of guidance when we talk to package managers and when we talk to tool authors.
Mhm.
Because that's like, for example, that's something that SBOM standards, I don't know about within TC54, but prior to TC54, the SBOM standards work in OpenSSF basically didn't account for that question at all. And so
Mhm.
everybody was saying, let's make it, you should make SBOMs. And then all the package maintainers had zero idea how to do that. How do you name the files? How do you annotate them? How do you point to them? Nobody's ever answered those questions in a way that can actually account for all ecosystems. So I think it's incumbent on us to do that to ensure adoption.
That's a very good point. Now, I think our group then would have the subject matter expertise to make the kind of recommendations that would be necessary. Now I'm sure we all kind of know key contacts at each of the package managers and the
Yes.
repos, right? Or we could theoretically also work with OSSF in doing the cat herding and that sort of thing as well. So either
Yeah,
way is
absolutely.
fine. Okay.
Cool.
All right.
And yeah, I mean, I would say that focusing on like prioritizing ecosystem integration by usage within important demographics. In other words, like the top two on that list are going to be NPM and Maven, right? And
Right.
like Python's probably a close third,
Mhm.
and so on. Like, so this may all be intuitive, but like that's like we should still say it out loud.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And yeah, but like obviously it's also good to get the full long tail of everything, right? Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe that's even something we add in. Um, like, is the integration something we think about when designing the spec? For example, in our constraints file, should we say, for example, we're going to design with, the use case for package managers, like
I
integration of
think we
package managers?
should.
Yeah.
And I think it's okay if the initial version of the spec is just for the data format, like for the
Mhm.
file, and we don't talk
Yeah.
about what you name the file or where the file goes or if it's on a URL or blah blah blah. But that's not going to be okay long term. That's just fine for the
Mhm.
initial version. Like longer
Mhm.
term, we need to say, like, here are the current, like we need to have an official place that lists, like, if you're in this ecosystem or using this tool, like this is
Mhm.
the guidance. And in order
Yeah.
to say that with some sort of authority, we also have to have the cooperation of that ecosystem's repository or package managers, um, which is
Yeah.
exactly why it can't be in the initial version, right? Unless we get them really enthusiastic really quickly. But like like I'm envisioning a world a couple years from now where
Yeah.
packages, any package in any ecosystem can declare its end of life status in a way that matches the specification. And then whatever the consuming tool is for their ecosystem will highlight that information. And if they, whatever their validation and publishing tool is, will validate it, right? So like for NPM, if you declare end of life state, or like if you declare your CLE events, then like you shouldn't be able to NPM publish if that information that's included in the package is invalid, right? And like so things like that. And then when it's present on npmjs.com under a package page, it says like support information as a tab or something, right? Like, and then I don't know how it would work for Go, but for anything that has an immutable package registry, right? For Go, maybe GitHub has to build something.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And there might be an opportunity here as well to, just thinking out loud here, there might be an opportunity here as well to work with the Perl folks, because we might want to reserve a name, reserve a qualifier. So like if you have like a Maven package,
But like
right?
com dot something.
Yeah, exactly. So if you've got like a Maven Perl or an NPM Perl, but maybe, just maybe, you are not necessarily keeping the CLE information on those registries for whatever reason. Maybe you have your own because you're a commercial entity and you have everything in one place on Oracle or ServiceNow or Microsoft or whatever. Having that reserved qualifier to point you to where you can find the CLE information, just like we have reserved qualifiers for download location, might be a useful thing.
Yeah. I think that's a great idea. It's like an official scope or whatever.
Yeah.
Someone has TC54 on NPM, but I'll see if I can get them to hand it over.
Yeah, as a transitional measure, we can add an external reference to the SBOM.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
for
Sure.
example, for Maven, I think only the SBOMs, which are immutable, are published there, and all goes through external references.
Yeah, I don't know what's happening over at Oasis in terms of that, because those folks haven't been overly responsive. But if in fact they deliver a specification, then theoretically there could be two ways to represent this, which would be less than ideal. But so having that external reference would be incredibly useful.
So especially since the SBOM doesn't specify format, so
Right.
I could make a PR to add it to 1.7. First, somebody can publish an HTML page that just says what's the support status, and then they can change it to a binary machine readable format.
Yeah.
Okay, so should we review the specification?
Let's do it.
Okay. Okay, so just a little overview here. And then the next section that I have is the schema definition. And don't know if I need to go over these individually. I could probably easier just show you the schema. But the first thing I changed was the date strings. I think originally, Steve, we had them as ISO 8601. And I added RFC 3339 here because I noticed that CycloneDX also uses this date format, and OSV also uses the date format. So I don't know. I'd like to kind of get consensus here, what everyone thinks of that.
There is so much overlap between both of these,
Mm-hmm.
and yet the ISO one does a bunch of stuff that the RFC doesn't do, and the RFC does a bunch of stuff that the ISO doesn't do. And both of them, quite honestly, do stuff that we don't want them to do. This is something that we're likely going to clarify in CycloneDX in terms of timestamps, but there's some crazy stuff in there that we honestly do not want.
Do we need the time part? Like if we just said RFC 3339 like up,
Yeah.
if up to and not including the letter T or whatever, does that eliminate a bunch of the weird stuff? Because like the time that it's effective is sort of irrelevant. It's not, it's more of a like year, month, day than it is a timestamp.
Doesn't JSON schema have a date versus a date time?
It might.
Because we may not
But-
need the time.
But
But
I mean,
33, 39, you can omit the time as well.
so for the
Oh, that's
effective,
okay.
so for the
Mhm.
effective date, I would say that we don't need the timestamp. For published and modified, those are timestamps, I think,
Agreed.
that do need
Yeah, that's
minute precision.
a fair point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Now,
mean, if
when it comes to like support and stuff, just thinking out loud here, when it comes to
Mhm.
things like support, and time and time zone actually might be
Mhm.
useful because at midnight at this particular time zone, your updates are now going to be cut off.
Yeah.
yeah, I guess that's a fair point. So it's not that we need a time, it's that we need a time zone. And the time with Z gives us that sort of,
Right.
yeah.
Oh,
But
yeah,
again, if you're doing 33, 39 and you specify a date time, you can actually omit the time and it'll still be valid.
but then you can't include the Z, or is it always in UTC if you do that?
That's a great question. I don't know.
If
I
it
mean,
ends in Z, I believe
if the
so.
time is, if you omit the time and the time is implicitly zeros Z, then like that's fine. That just means you have to include the time if you're not using UTC midnight. Yeah, I guess I don't have I don't have a strong feeling about which of these two formats we use, the RFC or the ISO, as long as we use one of them. I think that it would be very useful for the JavaScript ecosystem if whatever format we choose fits in very neatly with the temporal API that's stage 3 and shipping in browsers soon. But I think either of those two formats will be, as would just a year, month, day. So I'm not super concerned about it, and I don't know all the weird stuff, Steve, that you're referring to. I don't actually know exactly what you're talking about. So like, just because there's so much nuance there. So like, if there's a concrete reason to prefer one or the other, that sounds like the sort of thing we want to document somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, some of the interesting things is that you can specify like I don't know if this was the RFC or the ISO, but like just the integer representing the week of the year, like 26, for example, to represent the 26th week. That's actually a valid date. So there's some things that obviously we don't want, but I think and this is maybe why we chose it in CycloneDX, maybe. We need to choose, since this is going to be JSON, we need to choose whatever JSON schema actually supports.
Yeah, that's fair.
And I can't remember if that's the ISO or the RFC, honestly.
It looks
It looks
like
like it might be
the
8601. Sorry for the double there. Yeah, I think it's the ISO one.
and when it comes to precision, it's not like sort of at all relevant that some systems might go through like several releases in a single day. And wouldn't like sort of timestamp actually have any kind of relevance there? But basically to put them in the right order, as it were.
Yeah, I think
point.
yeah, that's true. We definitely
but
need the time precision here. I think we agreed that we need it also on the effective,
Well,
or no?
yeah, so I would say the only thing we need on effective is a date and a time zone. because
Mhm.
midnight is implied. However, if we do, since we don't have a format that can supply just a date and a time zone, we have to allow the time in order to cover alternate time zones. We can certainly mandate that the minute and second values are always 0, right? And then but like, actually, I don't even think that would work because there's half-hour time zones. So like, probably we shouldn't mandate it and just say it's any timestamp. But yeah.
Yeah.
So from my quick Googling, it seems like ISO format is what JSON schema recommends. So maybe
Okay.
that's what we should use.
Okay.
Okay.
Makes sense. Agreed. So, okay, back at the specification. So one of the main things that that I took from the other common lifecycle enumeration doc that we have is the different types of events, basically, because there are events that cover the entire component, and there are events that just cover a specific version of the component, right? And so right now, the only component event that we actually have is if a component gets renamed, right? And so, and the rest are just things that are applied to a specific version. So general availability of version 1.0.0 or something, right? And if we look at component renamed, this is the schema. I should make these larger, but
A challenge, like I see range in there, and that's
yeah.
excellent. A challenge there is that the Semver spec doesn't have ranges. There's an
Mhm.
open PR to add ranges to it that in a
Mhm.
way that it matches the way NPM does ranges.
Mhm.
And but there's also the way CVEs do ranges.
Mm.
And the way CVEs do it is like crappy and full of holes, but it at least is universally understood.
Right.
The way that, like, so it's I think deciding a range format is going to be tricky.
Mhm.
But we need something. Otherwise, everyone
Yeah.
has to exhaustively list version numbers, and that's not scalable.
Right.
So
Right.
Semver is adopting their own range specification, and they're not adopting
No. So
verse.
the Semver specification doesn't include a mention of ranges. There is an
Right.
open pull request on it to add ranges to that specification, and that PR, as I understand it, matches the way that NPM's Node Semver package has
Mhm.
always done ranges, like with carets and tildes and greater than and so on. And also, by the way NPM works with Semver is not this Semver version 2 doc.
Yes, it's not.
Right.
And I have an open PR as well. If my PR lands, then Semver 3 will be the way NPM does it. It's specifically around things in the version 0 bucket. But
Mhm.
but for version 1 and up, Semver v2 applies with that range PR in the node ecosystem. So we don't have to use the node ecosystem's ranges. It's just whatever range I'm not sure. I don't know anything about VERS yet. So if VERS comes up or includes
Verse
a
is
range
great.
specification.
That's
Yeah,
what
I
it
mean,
does. Yeah.
okay, so it has ranges in it.
Yeah.
That's what it does. It is a
Okay.
version range specification, and it
Okay.
covers Semver, it covers NPM, it covers Debian and Red Hat and basically everything.
Okay.
It is magical. So the
Okay.
fact that there's a PR for Semver is, I'm
Well,
scratching my
it's
head on that
many years old
because it's
I'm
is it?
sure it
Okay.
predates VERS, but
Yeah.
so either way, the Semver spec wouldn't need a range syntax that covers things beyond Semver. But it sounds
Mhm.
like whatever range syntax landed in the Semver spec could also be added to VERS, which makes VERS a superior choice for this specification.
Right. Exactly.
That's fine with me. Cool.
VERS is kind of like some sort of intermediate specification that allows us to
Like Perl.
use all the different type
Right.
of versioning schemes from
Yeah.
NPM or plain Semver or Maven or
Perfect.
something like that, right?
That's great.
I believe, right?
Awesome.
Yes,
Yeah, I
and
didn't know about it, but that sounds great. Awesome.
It's going to be going through, so once we get Perl done in TG2, the next step, because the same Perl group is also in charge of VERS, VERS will also then be standardized through Ecma. That's the plan.
We should,
Uh,
there's no NPM VERS tooling either, so put that on the VERS list.
Does VERS specify which versioning scheme, like which exist, which are valid? Or is the versioning scheme that exists,
You
can you
can
put anything there?
optionally, yeah, you can optionally use Perl types like NPM or Maven
Uh-huh.
or stuff like that. But you
Yeah.
can also go outside of those types and
Mm-hmm.
specify like semver, for example.
Mm,
Or you can specify, you know, something completely different. For example, you know, my employer has, you know, ranges that are city names, for example.
mm-hmm.
So you could do something that's purely alphabetic versus something that's numeric. So you could specify like ServiceNow or, you know, the Microsoft range specification or, you know, whatever you wanted to. The only difficult part is that on the consumption side, you actually have to know how to properly interpret how Debian or how Red Hat or how, you know, some other version range specification actually works.
Mm,
VERS gives you the common syntax to represent
mm-hmm.
the range. It doesn't tell you how to parse it.
So yes, it says here, tools should validate that the versioning scheme is a known scheme.
Yeah.
So in the specification itself, it sounds like it doesn't define a list of known versioning schemes that are valid. It just says that this is where the versioning scheme is, and then the tool, whoever creates the tool, it's up to them to implement the
That is
versioning scheme.
correct. That is correct.
Okay.
Again, the syntax of the version range is consistent, which
Mm-hmm.
right now, I mean, if you look at the way NPM does it and the way that Maven
Mm-hmm.
does it and everybody else, there's zero consistency.
Mm-hmm.
So VERS standardizes the syntax, but you
Mm-hmm.
still kind of need to know how to parse how like Debian does it, which is really, really interesting and
Mm-hmm.
completely not like Semver, for example, which is very simplistic.
Mm, interesting.
But you
That tech
can
that
use the Perl types, and that's
the
kind of the recommended way to do it. But if you have to go outside of that, then
mhm.
it allows you to do that.
So you could technically though, let's say that we CLE, okay, someone's using CLE, they produce a VERS, you know, with a versioning scheme that's completely new. Maybe it's specific to them or something like that. The consumer of the CLE might not know if they have the capability to digest that
Right.
VERS scheme.
But we can still
Technically, right?
represent it. Yeah.
You could represent it. Yeah, it's interesting.
So it doesn't lock us into using, you know, specific versioning range specifications,
Mhm,
and we wouldn't have to constantly evolve the spec because
mhm,
VERS takes care of that for us.
mhm. Interesting. But by not specifying the set of allowed versioning schemes, I suppose you like, I don't know. There's kind of there's
It's
trade-offs in both,
open-ended.
right? It's
Yeah, it's
open-ended, but then
open-ended.
also if you're a downstream consumer of VERS, you could be like, well, shoot, I don't have the tooling capable to, you know, handle this
Well,
version range.
even though the version range spec is open-ended, we could still lock it down in CLE. We could say here is the allow list of specifiers, and then that puts
Yeah.
the burden on us to expand that list, but it also ensures that for CLE at least it's a known list, a finite known list of
Mm-hmm.
formats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know if we should or not. It's just that's an option available to us.
Yeah, it would be an option because we could very easily do that with like regex or something like that on the field.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
actual implementation is easy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't have a strong opinion either way right now. I'm just bringing it up, but
Yeah.
something to think about. So, okay, so yeah, range, and then we have the vers here. So one thing to note was that there's, I was trying to figure out kind of like an elegant way of representing this, but there are some times when we want to specify version ranges, and there are some times when we want to specify single versions, right?
Mhm.
And so I'm trying to figure out kind of maybe the naming for these fields that would make sense. I just have version, and then it expects a single vers version. And then range expects a range of versions from vers. And
I can't
you know,
remember what we did in CycloneDX, but it allowed us to specify ranges, and it allowed us to specify one or more versions, because
okay.
there's some things, there's going to be some software where it is not going to be, you're not going to be able to use a version range spec.
Oh yeah, that's true. So
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
so why don't we call it versions? So the singular one is a single version, and the plural one can be either a single version, a single range, or an array of either.
Hmm.
Let me
CycloneDX calls one version, the other one range. So CycloneDX use a range, a property called range, and a property called version. One
Okay.
of those should be present.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so, but if you want to target multiple versions and a single range will not do it for whatever reason, then we have to allow an array anyway.
Right. This is the way, I'm just going to put this link in the thing here. Oh, okay. You found it in the doc, it looks like. I just put the link to
Versions.
the
Yeah.
the online documentation.
Yeah, so
Yes.
that row is exactly what I was suggesting. I think that's great.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. So versions, okay. Or range.
Yeah, it says versions or a range of versions, and it can be
Mhm.
0 or more. So it's, yeah, I guess it's fine to make it always be an array. It's being too JavaScripty about it, but
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
And it should be one or the other. I think that makes sense, right?
Yes, I think it's versions that can either have a property version or a property range. So it's an array that can have a version property or range property.
Oh, is that right?
oh,
Oh,
it has to be an
Yeah,
array
I'm
of
looking
objects.
at the spec.
Yeah. So versions. So
Yeah.
we at the top we've got versions, which is the array, and
Ah.
inside that array, each element can be either a version or a range.
I see.
Is how CycloneDX
That's in the S
treats
bomb.
it.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Now, whether or not we
Okay.
want to adopt the same thing is,
Yeah, I mean, I think in
that's
this
up for
case
debate,
that
but
we want the inverse. Like that's saying, like you're trying to have one item that covers one or more package versions, and each package version is only in one of those buckets, presumably, right?
right. But I think that, like in the case of the component renamed, right? Don't we want the same kind of thing?
Oh, sorry. In component renamed?
Yeah.
So component renamed, actually, so range shouldn't exist here at all.
Yeah, that doesn't,
Yeah. So range
like
should
a
not
rename
exist
doesn't
here.
need a version really at all. A rename is just a pointer.
Yeah.
I guess, and if it did have a version, it would need a from version and a to version to say these two are equivalent with a different name. But like, you wouldn't ever want to target, I think, multiples, would you? I guess you could if you wanted to say that the two, well, I think, okay, I think conceptually maybe we should separate this project. This project's name is gone and it has a new name somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
That shouldn't have any versions at all. That's just like a redirect. You now need to look at that thing. But
Exactly.
a separate item would be this version of this package as a official replacement that is this version of this package. And I don't even know if we
Mm,
need that at all, but if we did, I think it should be its own thing and not part of renaming.
I see. So it was like replaced by a subsequent package after this version or something like that.
Yeah,
Is
like
what- yeah.
well, yeah, actually, I guess that's well.
So,
So if package A is renamed to package B,
mhm,
then that in theory should mean there are no more versions of package A ever again.
mhm,
And it also means that and any direct correlation between version numbers in A and B are irrelevant.
mhm,
That just means you have to manually read change logs and stuff and figure out which version of B to switch to. That's just on
mhm,
you. That's not an end of life event. That's just or a CLE event. That's just like heads up, this package is dead and it's pointing you in this general direction. An alternative would be like there's a dead package and it has these 3 versions I have forked over here. And like I want to somehow indicate that version 1 is this version of this package, version 2 is this version of this package, and version 3 is this version of this package. That's like an alternative or a replacement. And in that
mhm,
case, you want a single version to a single version mapping.
mhm.
But that's so totally separate from this project is permanently dead and a new project is where you need to go look as a human.
And
That's like you could transparently replace this Perl with this Perl and it should work.
Mhm, mhm.
And what happens if a project is renamed, but for backward compatibility, old versions, security updates are still published?
On the old one.
Yeah. So, for example, Commons, Apache Commons has new packages are renamed, new major versions are renamed, but the old major version is still maintained with the same old Perl.
Mhm.
Yeah, because the group IDs and
Then I
stuff are
guess to
different,
allow
right?
for that, the rename wouldn't imply necessarily end of support of the old one. And it would be coupled with an additional event, a second event in most cases. First is it's renamed, and the second simultaneous event would be it's now end of life. And in the case you're talking about, Peter, it would just not have that second event.
Yeah. But maybe we can specify that it's renamed and there will be no versions with version number higher than that.
Yeah, I guess you could add a Boolean or something to the rename event and have it say like this also serves as an end of life. If that's such a common case.
Well,
So it's common to change Maven coordinates each time you have a new version, a new major version. So the old major version has one set of Maven coordinates. The new one has another one, so that projects can have both and they are
Right.
compatible.
Right.
The,
But the
Yeah, so
old
that's
one
something we
is
need to
not,
think about
it
is
does not reach end
supporting.
of support immediately.
Right.
And
So we need to handle both of those use cases like empirically. One is I've renamed a thing, the old one's dead, the new one is the replacement. The other is I've renamed a thing, but they're both still supported, as in the Maven case. So as whatever we decide, we don't have to dive into the weeds too hard in the next 8 minutes, but I think I assume we all agree we need to support both of those use cases.
yeah, I think we do need to be very, very clear though, like in the case that
Mhm.
Piotr was mentioning where, they have a major release of something. So now the group ID is like, changed. We need to be very clear on, if we say that something is end of life, that we're talking about this particular branch of the thing, not the project itself.
Right. That's what the range should indicate, right? Like you
Right.
should be able to say like all version 1s are end of life, and that doesn't implicate version 2s.
Right.
this this conversation kind of reminds me that like the problem scope for us would be extremely simple if we were just to support like open source projects with major package registries. You know what I mean? Like fundamentally, like the way that things are distributed and installed, let's say like consumer applications or desktop applications, their versioning schemes are very different. And even, you know, even supporting like hardware use cases, very different. So, you know, I think things will be much easier for just supporting, let's say, package managers. And I don't know, sorry
I mean,
to bring
I'm
this
fine
up in
with
the
that as
last
an
like 5
initial.
minutes, but
No, I'm fine. I'd be fine with that as an initial version, but like we still
yeah,
need to account for eventually supporting those things in the future,
yeah, yeah.
right? Like, because if we actually achieve the open source adoption we're hoping, then all those other things are going to want to use it.
Mm-hmm.
And if we design ourselves into a corner, then we'll just have to have these meetings again in a few years and make it a whole new standard. So,
Yeah.
but I 100% agree that for
Mm-hmm.
that, like I'm always going to be comfortable with limiting scope as long as we have designed it in a way that we're not boxing ourselves out of something we want to do in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And personally, I only care about the open source things. I just know that lots of people care about the stuff beyond that.
Yeah. The difficult thing is I think we don't have the community participation for the hardware space at
Right.
least, or for the,
I can get it.
yeah.
I can get it from the medical device side.
Okay.
Oh, and another thing is actually we can just not need to get it right away by adding an additional top level key, and we should do this anyway, version
Uh-huh.
that describes the version of the specification. We should never have that be omitted. It should always be required. And even if it's always 1 forever, but that gives us the freedom to make it 2 in the future.
Yeah.
And in that way, if we do box ourselves in a corner, we could just make version 2 that supports something different. And
Yeah.
that might be a really, like, it's great, Steve, that you have that resource, and it might be worth talking to them anyway. But like, that might actually make it really easy to cut the scope, because then we don't have to be as worried about boxing ourselves into a corner.
Right.
Can we make it a URL?
Yeah, like a
version?
schema URL type of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, given those are just string values, right? So it doesn't have to actually. So like, even if the domain gets hijacked, it's not a security issue. So that seems fine. Cool.
One teeny comment on the description there for a component renamed. It suggests that the old component has been renamed to new component, because number one, that's sort of more sort of human understandable without having to reference other fields. And secondly, it actually fits in with the structure of a description of, say, for instance, superseded by, which you can see above.
Yeah. And it's also, I think it's a useful indicator if we think there's a common boilerplatey description people will use. That's a nice suggestion that perhaps we should think about a way to encode that such that that description could be inferred. Like, in other words, a description in the same way as a code comment, right? A good description will be something that doesn't make sense to represent in the schema. That's like additional context that shouldn't be contained within the actual part that matters for a human. And it's the same with a code comment, right? You want to say why and give history instead of saying what, right? Like,
yeah, that's true. That's true. I can update this. I think my intention was more like description should say basically what's in the reference. Like the reference, I assume, is some sort of announcement or something or some event, and the description should kind of be a summary of what that was, or maybe it should be a summary. I don't know.
yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess I would say description could even maybe we should say, like, the description should be an explanation of a brief explanation of why the change was made. Because that's a piece that'll never be anywhere else in the schema. It will be in that reference blog post or whatever, in theory, but like, you know, there shouldn't need to be a link somewhere.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. So I think we're basically at time here.
Yeah.
For our next meeting, I still had some things here that I would like to go over. I would still like to go over some of these. Well, actually, if we could do this async and some people could kind of take a look at the PR and review the different events that are here so far, making sure that we have all the events that, you know, that are appropriate for version 1, and then, you know, making sure everything kind of makes sense. Because we already found out that we don't need range here. But
Right.
I'm going to update the PR with the stuff that we discussed today. And then for next week, what I'd like to go over is around extended support options and how those would be represented. And then also, I think I would like to talk about distribution a little bit. We kind of touched on it, like package managers and stuff.
Yeah.
But I think we'll probably need at least 30 minutes here. So
Right.
yeah. Yep.
Cool.
So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, after you update the PR, I'll put some comments on it before next meeting.
Sounds good. I'll post an update in Slack to let you guys know that I've updated.
Awesome. Thanks, Benji.
All right. Thanks,
Great call.
everyone.
Thanks.
Cool.
Cheers.
See you
Yeah.
next time.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.